Development has proved to be a great opportunity for governments to partner with private investors to further enhance economic progress. And joining us for more is Andrew Maggs, who's an independent research analyst. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us. As I say, great opportunity. Whether or not we're seeing enough of it taking place is the big question. Before we get to that, what kind of deficit are we facing right now? What's the current stance that we're seeing in terms of infrastructure development on the African continent, or status rather? And what are you making of the pace of transformation we're seeing in that space?
Well, albeit strides have been made over recent years, the reality is that there is, as you referred to it, an infrastructure deficit. The continent needs in the region of $93 billion to be spent every year for the next 10 years going forward to address that deficit. Now, if you look at current funding, it's around about 45 to 50 billion. Now, probably efficiency gains could make an impact as well, but at the end of the day, you're still left with that deficiency in terms of funding. And the obvious question, who's going to fund this? Whether it'll be the continent's traditional development partners. I'm referring to the likes of World Bank, African Development Bank, the multinationals. Will we see an increase in private sector participation in infrastructure projects? All this is what will decide the state of infrastructure going forward.
And there's talk of a new bank, a new BRICS bank and that kind of thing, so maybe, but that's some years down the line. Surely the way has to be public-private partnerships, and then you have to ask what's the private incentive, because there's got to be a return on this. Is the thinking, is the mindset among African governments? I mean, the South African government certainly, I don't think, has enough of a mindset of saying, let's involve the private sector. They want to do things themselves, and in fact, to an increasing extent, rather than reducing it.
David, I accept that, and the more private sector involvement, the better, but, and you bring up a valid point, there's got to be an incentive. And any private investor, whether it be for a new railway, a port, a hydropower project, they've got to be guarantees in place. Return on investment and enabling infrastructure. And we can touch on this later, but whether you're building a new mine,
touch on it now. Yeah.
A new mine, a cement plant, a hotel, you want reliable, affordable power. That's an imperative. And also, you mentioned South Africa maybe lagging behind here, albeit the renewable energy project initiative has finally kicked in. One hopes that will lead to more private sector involvement. But David, if I can, for a moment, just stay on the power sector, because for me that's critical. And I think it's Donald Kabaruku, who's head of the African Development Bank, refers to that as having a chokehold on growth on the continent. And the reality is you don't have power resources evenly distributed around the continent, particularly hydropower resources. So it requires greater regional cooperation.
Are we seeing enough of that? Because there's a lot of emphasis being drawn and placed on policy and regulation, where we've got, for example, transnational projects hindered by rules. For example, we've got an IPP project located in Zambia, not allowed to sell excess supply to an SOE like Eskom. Should we be seeing a loosening of those rules and those regulatory frameworks?
It's fair comment, and I think what we've seen in the past, unfortunately, is individual countries going ahead with individual development agendas as opposed to looking at the bigger picture. It's important to understand now you've got this PIDA is the acronym. It's this program for infrastructure development in Africa, which seems to have the buy-in from all the major players, the governments, the lending institutions. And Pidas has been able to draw up a list of 20, 30 projects across various sectors, power, transport, ICT, with a regional dimension. Whether it's, for example, power from Mpundo and Kua in Mozambique to get it onto the Southern African power pool, the North-South corridor, which would greatly enhance trade, and that affects about 4 or 5 countries. So
Andrew, one of the dangers, I think, with big projects like this is that there are big obvious projects that are not happening, like hydroelectric power from the Congo River, and apparently that could solve our electricity problems if we could sort out, it's not a technical thing, it's a political and social and economic thing. That's the one. So that's a project we need, but it doesn't seem to happen. And then you have the high-speed train to Durban, which would probably cost more than R1 trillion if you look at the way things escalate. And because it's so big and it looks visionary, people kind of accept it, but maybe it's nonsense.
David, yeah, I mean, I suppose it comes down to, planning properly. And I think there are examples of projects on the continent that haven't been thought through, so they might have short-term benefits.
And to say, government, you see, we're doing something, even if we don't need it.
Exactly, and I don't want to use that, bit of trophy punting, to be honest. And at the end of the day, I think you've just got to assess what the priorities are for individual countries, what I said a moment ago, looking at the regional dimension as well, and then planning around that. But going forward, David, I mean, the challenge is massive. I mean, we're seeing mass urbanization, mega cities. There are 2 at the moment in Africa. They reckon within 20, 30 years, that'll be 7 to 8 cities on the continent. And with that, of course, it brings its challenges, service delivery, and just trying to make this dent into poverty as well.
The biggest challenge as you see it, Andrew, needing to be overcome here, because if we're looking at South Africa as an example, we've got the blueprints, we've got the budget being laid out, it's just not being spent effectively.
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is implementation. It's all very well having funding for projects, and end of the day, though, they've got to be executed properly. And many of these projects are large and sophisticated. And if you don't have capacity, the requisite skills within implementing agencies, whether it's a roads department or a power utility, you're not going to be able to advance those projects. So it's skilling up to then roll them out properly.